In 1954, Joseph McCarthy was censured by the United States Senate. Absent from that vote was the junior senator from Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Kennedy was in the hospital at the time. Whether it was necessity that he be there was often debated because his younger brother, Robert Kennedy, had been on McCarthy's staff. And so it was a little bit embarrassing, I think, for the family now that it came up for a vote. So McCarthy was censured, and that eliminated the last national political figure for the conservative movement. Now, there was not, remember, much of a movement at this point. It was newsletters, a few books, a few speeches. There wasn't anything like an organized political conservative movement at the time of McCarthy's censure. But it did eliminate a major figure. He was a national figure, and a lot of conservatives had become emotionally committed to him because of his stand against the infiltration of the government by communists. And the debate still goes on as to whether it was true. I think in the book by Stan Evans on McCarthy that there's enough evidence that there was infiltration that McCarthy at least had a case to make and was legitimate in finding just how many people really were committed to communism. Shadorof's position, however, was pretty good. He just said the best way to get the communists out of the government is to shut down the government. And that, of course, that would have worked as far as getting them out of the government. The problem was, as always, the question of institutional loyalty, the loyalty oath issue. And every government has that issue. You have to have some form of a commitment verbally and publicly to the government in what Christians call a covenantal sense for any civil government to operate. And that was the fundamental issue. It was the question of loyalty, the loyalty oath issue. And liberals hated the idea of the loyalty oath and still do, but it is in the Constitution. It is in Article 6, Section 3. There is a legitimate function of the loyalty oath, but the Constitution simply prohibits any religious test oath as a means of coming into power. It does not forbid any other kind of test oath. And we do have the swearing in of the president and swearing in of political officers with their hands, amazingly enough, on the Bible rather than on the Constitution, where they swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. So there are loyalty oaths. They're basic to government. You have them in the armed forces. But liberals don't like loyalty oaths because it brings up the question of, amazingly enough, loyalty. And they perceive that a person who's employed by the government with the power of government behind them and the monopoly of government power to support their position, that they really do have to swear some kind of loyalty to the government. And the left has hated that, certainly ever since the McCarthy era. In 1955, William F. Buckley was able to raise enough money to start a magazine called National Review. And that magazine became the intellectual magazine of the conservative movement for probably the next 15 years, the major outlet. He had Hazlitt associated with him. He had free market economists if not on the staff, certainly publishing. He had a lot of ex-communists, I mean real hardcore ex-communists who had defected. He was a friend of Chambers. Chambers was certainly in that circle of friends and associates of Buckley. It was an attempt to fuse together the free market economists and the anti-communists with just enough natural law theory and just enough what we might call cultural conservatism to make possible a biweekly magazine that would report on politics, some cultural affairs, provide book reviews, and so forth. There was no such magazine for conservatives prior to this time. And it was well written. He did hire effective writers. There was a market for it. Now, it never became a dominant force. It's certainly not anywhere near as popular as the magazine with that same name is today. But it did give conservatives a sense that they were not alone, and this was extremely important in 1955. And word began to get out that there was such a magazine, anti-communist, pro-free market, pro-traditional values, and well-written. And so he began to get subscribers. In that same year, 1955, Grove City College, a four-year institution, private Presbyterian-related institution in western Pennsylvania, hired a man to come and head the economics department. His name was Hans Sennholz. Sennholz is one of the odd figures in American conservative life, an amazing figure really when you think about it. He'd been a Luftwaffe pilot, shot down, sent to the United States, where there were something in the range of 40 to 50,000 German POWs, which is almost never talked about, and about maybe 5,000 Italians. He was sent to a farm in Arkansas with a lot of other Germans, and as he said, we were all Germans and we were all efficient, and we took over the management of that farm, and it became famous in terms of its efficiency and how well it was run. And he spent his time as a prisoner of war in the United States. He learned English, of course, very well. He knew English, but now he became fluent. And went back after the war to Germany and took a degree in political science. And then he'd been reading in the library, and he came across a book by Mises on the theory of money and credit. And he said, this is what I believe. I want to study with this man. Where is he? And he found out he was at New York University. And so he came to the United States to study under Mises and received a PhD under Mises, one of 4 PhDs who received their degrees under Mises. And at that point, he was hired by Grove City specifically because the biggest donor of Grove City and most famous alumnus was J. Howard Pugh. And J. Howard Pugh was an exceptionally rich man. The Pugh family was the family behind Sun Oil and Sunoco, and it had gone toe-to-toe against the Rockefeller organization at that time for over 60 years, and Rockefeller was never able to defeat him. They wanted to, couldn't do it. Very efficient company, and Howard Pugh was incredibly wealthy and a big donor to Grove City, and if Howard Pugh said jump, the president of the Grove City said how high. And he said, I want this young man brought in, and they brought him in as a free market economist, and there he stayed until the early 1990s as the chairman of the department. And he was a follower of Mises, and he staffed the department with men generally favorable to Mises. And that became the college you sent your child to if you wanted a free market education based on the Austrian Economic School perspective. And so Grove City became at least one institution for conservatives to send their kids to, especially if they wanted to study economics. In 1956, the Foundation for Economic Education began to publish a magazine called The Freeman. They'd had the name of The Freeman for some time. It had gone in and out of publication. But now it began to be published as a monthly magazine of about 64, 65 pages, defending free market ideas, or as Reed called it, the freedom philosophy. And so now you had 2 outlets. You had National Review as the political side of it, and you had the Freeman as the economic philosophical side of it. In fact, Buckley had wanted to get the Freeman, but Reed wouldn't sell it to him, wouldn't sell the name to him. And so Buckley started National Review, and then the next year, Foundation for Economic Education began publishing the Freeman. That magazine was passed to more people, more students, more people of my generation. If you'd ask them, well, how did you become a conservative? He'd say, well, somebody gave me a copy of the Freeman. And that's what happened to me. Somebody gave me a copy of the Freeman. And I began reading the Freeman in the late 1950s. So the Freeman became an outlet, an important outlet for the study and dissemination of explicitly free market ideas. And Leonard Read was hardcore. He did not believe government should be doing much of anything except defending the peace. His concept of the government was a night watchman and nothing more. So it was, no question about it, the most libertarian magazine at the time, and in fact Read popularized the word libertarian. He wrote a book called Elements of Libertarian Leadership. In 1958, ex-candy maker named Robert Welch started the John Birch Society. This organization would be anti-communist. It would talk about conspiracies later on, but in the early years it was pro-free market, anti-communist, and it would talk about communist infiltration. And the outlet was called American Opinion, but Welch published a regular newsletter, and the Birch Society was intended to be a grassroots anti-communist organization, not political, but certainly anti-communist. And it began to spread very rapidly as the conservative movement now began to take root. You began to see some traction out there. People would tell other people. They could do minimal direct mail marketing. You even had a situation of an ex-FBI agent named Dan Smoot. And Smoot began to go on local television, sponsored by Dr. Ross Dog Food. We all remember that from my generation. And Smoot would be on the independent stations, filmed, giving very, very articulate defenses of constitutional liberty. He really was a scholar of the Constitution. He was a lawyer by training. Good-looking guy, powerful speaker, good in front of a camera, good in front of a group. And he finally got a sponsor who could get him into some of the larger cities, not on the networks, but in the local stations. So bit by bit, we began to see slowly the work into the media. They'd done it in the newsletters, then a few books, small publishing houses in the 40s and 50s, and continuing thereafter, but only really 3 or 4 publishers. Devin Adair, a little outfit called Caxton, and Regnery. That was basically it. 3 publishing houses with an occasional book published by some famous conservative, once in a while by some New York publishing house. But it was small-scale stuff. It was word of mouth. And no other way to put it. It was word of mouth. It was little groups getting together, little study groups. Very often it was women. Women who had the time to read the congressional record, to read pamphlets on this or that aspect of the history of the New Deal, and especially in Southern California. These women would get together in these study groups, and they would have seminars, effectively seminars, on what am I reading and what are you reading, and they began to pass around information. These little groups, completely off the radar, of people with no political skills whatsoever, and really not much political ambition at all, but very much concerned that the country was departing from its historic roots, and they began to call themselves conservatives. And in 1960, a senator from Arizona named Barry Goldwater took advantage of this and wrote a book, or co-authored a book, or as some would say, simply signed the manuscript to a book called The Conscience of a Conservative. Now, the researcher, we know who it was a man named Brent Bozell. And Bozell had been the debate partner in Yale of Buckley. And Buckley and Bozell were probably as powerful a 1-2 punch in debate as the conservative movement has ever produced. Bozell did a lot of the research, maybe some of the writing. It's a debated issue. But certainly Goldwater put his name on it. Short manifesto, basically the old style manifesto. Here's what I believe. Well, he found out that a lot of people believed it. And that book, over the years, was eventually to sell a couple of million copies. That book became the kind of a testament of this fledgling conservative movement. Now, he was anti-communist. He was basically pro-free market. He wanted less government. He was under the shadow of the toughest man the Senate had had almost in history, Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson ran the Senate like a medieval fiefdom, and Goldwater was in resistance against it, wouldn't cooperate. Out from the West. So they began to tag him with the cowboy. But he'd been in the Air Force, he flew a plane, he was a shortwave radio guy. He also was a tremendous photographer, but most people don't know that. I've seen some of the photographs. He really was great on Western photography, especially anything related to the Arizona Indians. So, and he was articulate. He could give a speech, and he couldn't be pushed around. And if Lyndon Johnson couldn't push you around, you couldn't be pushed around, and he couldn't be pushed around. So he writes this book, and people began to read it. And almost at the same time, there was a meeting at Buckley's house, estate in Connecticut, Sharon, Connecticut, of young, activist, conservative, college-age leaders. Buckley had assembled them because he'd become, again, a major figure for the last 5 years because of National Review. And they created an organization called Young Americans for Freedom, and they issued a statement. It's come down as the Sharon Statement. And that statement was a kind of fusionist document of the anti-communist and the pro-free market people. And it's a pretty good statement of what conservatism was in 1960. It was carefully crafted. And those two documents, the Sharon Statement aimed at the college students and the Conscience of a Conservative, which was aimed at basically the conservative lay person out there in the hinterlands who was an anti-communist and didn't like what the government was doing, wanted to see a smaller government, was not happy with Eisenhower and the leadership of the Eisenhower administration. That was the person who was going to buy that book. And they did buy that book. And Goldwater all of a sudden becomes a national figure. He replaces, for the first time, he replaces either Taft, if you were a kind of libertarian Republican, or he replaced Joseph McCarthy if you were an anti-communist Republican. He fuses the two groups in one person. And at the Republican National Convention, there was a group of a handful of conservatives who pushed forward a Goldwater for vice president movement. Now, it was a movement in the sense that a bunch of guys get together and get out some stickers and buttons are a movement. But in fact, they were able to get into the convention and onto the floor of the convention and had a brief time when they paraded around and held up the signs and blew whistles and all the tremendously important things that delegates to conventions do, except they didn't get drunk afterwards. And that became the first time that a lot of Republicans who were not conservatives had ever heard of Barry Goldwater. So you began to see around the figure of Goldwater the beginning of a politically self-conscious conservative movement. And I think that's the first time you see it. And Goldwater is now in a position to speak out as a representative figure for what turned out to be millions of Americans who did not like the direction in which the country was moving. They'd had no one at that point for over 5 years who could articulate their position in a national audience and in a national forum, namely the United States Senate. And a senator does have influence, and he can get speeches, and if he's articulate enough, or if he's controversial enough, he can get a lot of publicity. And Goldwater was good at all of those things. He was controversial, he was articulate, and he was able to get a lot of publicity. Nixon ran for president, perceived as a conservative at the time, still perceived as a conservative, against Kennedy, who was perceived as a liberal. Now, the fact of the matter was, there was hardly any difference between the two of them. They were pretty good friends. They'd both been in the Navy. They were standard patriotic Americans. They had both trained in the law. Kennedy's father, there's nothing liberal about Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy, if there was a conservative in the 30s, it was Joe Kennedy. He was a conservative, and he did have some political savvy. Roosevelt, after having appointed him as the ambassador to London, really broke with him, hated him in the later years, really hated him. So old Joe was a pretty conservative guy from a political standpoint. He was ambitious for his family. That's what he was, more than anything else. And so he'd been grooming Jack for president. He wanted his other son to be President Joe, but Joe was killed in the war. So it fell on Jack to be the president. And I think that decision was made pretty early in that family. And Bobby had been on the staff of the most hated senator of all, McCarthy. So it's pretty hard to tar and feather Jack Kennedy with being a political liberal. And he wins the election. And primarily because of media. He came off better on television in the first debate. Nixon didn't. The people who listened to the debate on the radio thought Nixon had won it. And the people who watched it on television thought Kennedy had won it. And this was the sign that television was going to be the medium of the future. That if you couldn't win on television, you weren't going to win the presidency. And from that point on, you had a figure who was one of the great television personalities imaginable, Jack Kennedy, who was in a position to mobilize people. He was a good speaker. And I'll say, for somebody who lived through that era, I have never heard anybody at a press conference who had the absolute mastery of the press. He had them eating out of his hand. He was funny, he was quick, he read incredibly fast, thousands of words a minute. He memorized everything. He was smart, but he wasn't very liberal. And Nixon wasn't very conservative. And so the 1960 election, which may have been seen in retrospect as a conservative versus liberal, complete misunderstanding of what took place at that point. It was Republican versus a Democrat, and it was just razor thin. And the old line went afterwards. There was a comedian, black comedian, funny, became popular in the early 1960s, named Dick Gregory. And he said, "Hey, I know about politics. I'm from Cook County, Illinois. Cook County is where your vote really counts and counts and counts." And that was right. They beat him in Cook County, Illinois. Nixon lost the election. It was rigged. Of course, on real close elections, you assume that. But he didn't fight it. He said, "I don't want to split the country. I'm not going to fight it." And he bowed out gracefully, and Jack Kennedy came in. Well, then you had just a series of disasters. I mean, the Berlin Wall went up, separating East Berlin from West Berlin. Kennedy doesn't do anything about it. I don't know if he could have done anything about it, but he didn't do anything about it. Then you have the Bay of Pigs invasion. They were going to overturn Castro. And it was just, if it hadn't been such a tragedy, it would have been a Keystone Cops movie. It was just a disaster from start to finish. And the men who invaded were caught and put into prison camps. Some were tortured. It was a disaster. And it rubbed off on Kennedy. It was a very, very serious event in his administration. He didn't get much done. We forget about that. He didn't get much done. And the Camelot thing, that was Jackie Kennedy's invention, a literal self-conscious invention that she worked with the media after his death. I mean, the Camelot was Jackie's deal. It was not Jack's. And of course, she was extremely photogenic. And she wasn't, I don't call her articulate, but she could stand up and she could speak in French and she could speak in English pretty well. And Kennedy wasn't far from the truth when he was visiting France, that he just said, I want to introduce myself as the man who has accompanied Mrs. Kennedy, and that was kind of true. They were in the history of the American presidency, there's never been a pair as photogenic, as truly photogenic as those two. But he wasn't liberal. So then what's happening? The conservative movement perceived the loss, but they didn't feel too bad about it really with Nixon. He wasn't really trusted very much by that stage. And the conservative, what you call conservative Christianity, was barely functioning. It had been out of the picture almost from the mid-18th century. Certainly the conservative movement did not have, from a Christian standpoint, any kind of widely known figures at that point. So you were living at that time in what I would call a strictly politically defined conservatism or liberalism. There might be political liberals who were also theological liberals, because the progressives were always very close to the social gospel promoters. And there was a kind of instinctive conservatism about members of the, say, the Southern Baptist Convention, in the South especially. But they voted Democratic, straight ticket Democratic. They were not going to vote Republican. So there was no real self-conscious, any kind of Christian Protestant organization in 1960. Didn't exist. Now you talk about the media. In 1962 they launched Telstar, and this was the first communications satellite. And as it turned out, that was maybe the most important event of 1962. But there were other events that took place. You had Dan Smoot, who wrote The Invisible Government, which was the first expose that anyone had read of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he tied them in with liberal progressivism. He tied them to people who were, if not traitors within the government, certainly they were not willing to have any kind of a confrontation with communism. These were people who were part of some form of cooperation between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the United States, all of which, by the way, was true. I mean, that was the basic push of the Council on Foreign Relations in that period. But it was the first time that anybody had heard about it, and it was immediately perceived of as an expose of a conspiracy. And Smoot became famous for that book at that point. And he told me that they sold about 1 million of them. And the incredible thing was, the stunning thing was, he didn't keep the names and addresses. He didn't have a mailing list. He had some mailing lists, and there was a Dan Smoot report, but in terms of the opportunity, that book would have organized an awful lot of people, and it didn't. That same year, a book was published by a small publishing house called Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard, which was an extension, basically, of Mises's Human Action. And that was to lead to the real development of the libertarian movement, because Rothbard became, if any one man can be said to have formed the libertarian movement, if it wasn't Reed, then it was Rothbard. And Rothbard, in terms of getting publicity, getting people together, getting things written, Rothbard was the master. All roads in libertarianism lead back to Rothbard. He was an anarchist. He was an atheist, but he believed in the free market, and he was happily married to a Christian lady, and it certainly was the best writing economist, I think, ever. I don't think anybody will argue with that. Extraordinarily gifted writer. And I personally never met anybody who knew more about everything and who could write it down rapidly than Rothbard. Genius does not describe what he was. He had an extraordinary grasp of politics, of economics. He knew a lot about culture. He knew local politics. He knew economic theory. He knew the history of political thought. I never met anybody who was as good, who could sit down with a stack of note cards and just write you off the materials. R.J. Rushdoony was very, very good. Erich von Kuehnelt-Leddihn was very good. But from a mastery of the literature, from a perspective, Rothbard really was the master of all the ones I've met. We're talking then about the rise of the conservative movement as a political force under Goldwater's leadership in the next presentation.